The sons of Levi, Moses' own tribe, responded to his call. These were men who chose loyalty to God over tribal loyalty, who were willing to take a stand for righteousness even when it was costly. Moses gave them a hard command. "Thus says the Lord God of Israel, put your sword on your side, each of you, and go to and fro from gate to gate throughout the camp, and each of you kill his brother and his companion and his neighbor." About 3,000 people died that day, those who had led the rebellion and refused to repent even when confronted with their sin. It was a terrible price, but it demonstrated that covenant with God is not a matter of casual commitment. The holiness of God demands holy living, and persistent rebellion against his clear commands has deadly consequences. Moses' willingness to authorize this judgment, even against his own people, showed how completely he had embraced his role as God's representative. Personal popularity, tribal loyalty, and political considerations all became secondary to obedience to God's will. This was leadership that put God's glory above personal comfort or approval. But Moses' heart was broken by what had happened. The next day, he went back up the mountain to intercede once more for the people. His prayer was one of the most moving in all of Scripture. "Alas, this people has sinned a great sin. They have made for themselves gods of gold. But now if you will forgive their sin, but if not, please blot me out of your book that you have written." Moses was willing to be condemned himself if that would save his people. He offered to give up his own salvation, his own relationship with God, his own eternal destiny, if it would secure forgiveness for those he led. This was substitutionary love at its highest level, the kind of love that points forward to the ultimate sacrifice of Christ for his people. God's response revealed both justice and mercy. "Whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book. But now, go lead the people to the place of which I have spoken to you. Behold, my angel shall go before you. Nevertheless, in the day when I visit, I will visit their sin upon them." Individual responsibility could not be transferred. Each person would bear the consequences of their own choices. But corporate mercy was still possible. The people could continue their journey toward the promised land, though they would bear the scars of their rebellion. God's grace was greater than their sin, but his justice would not be ignored. Moses' intercession had prevailed, but at great cost. The relationship between God and his people had been damaged by their betrayal. God announced that he would not go up among them personally, lest he consume them in their sinfulness. Instead, he would send an angel to lead them. This was protection, but it was also a form of divine withdrawal, a consequence of their broken faith. The people's response to this news showed that they finally understood the gravity of what they had done. When they heard that God would not go with them personally, they mourned and stripped off their ornaments. The jewelry that had once been made into an idol was now put away as a sign of repentance. They began to understand that relationship with God was more precious than his gifts, that his presence was more valuable than his provision. Moses pitched a tent outside the camp and called it the tent of meeting. Anyone who sought the Lord would go out to this tent, and when Moses entered it, the pillar of cloud would descend and God would speak with Moses. All the people would worship each at his tent door as they watched the cloud descend. This became a powerful symbol of mediation. Moses, standing between the holy God and the sinful people, making relationship possible despite their unworthiness. In the tent of meeting, God spoke with Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend. This intimate communion was both a privilege and a burden for Moses. He experienced the joy of direct fellowship with God, but he also bore the responsibility of representing God's will to often rebellious and ungrateful people. Moses' growing intimacy with God led him to make a bold request. "Please show me your glory." He wanted to see God as he really is, to experience the fullness of divine revelation. God's response was both generous and protective. "I will make all my goodness pass before you, and will proclaim before you my name, the Lord. But you cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live." God placed Moses in a cleft of the rock and covered him with his hand while his glory passed by. Then he removed his hand and allowed Moses to see his back, but not his face. This was as much of God's glory as any human being could experience and survive. It was a moment of unparalleled privilege and intimacy between the Creator and his chosen servant. When Moses came down from this encounter, his face shone with reflected glory so brightly that the Israelites could not look at him. He had to put a veil over his face when speaking to the people, only removing it when he went back into the presence of God. This was a physical demonstration of what it means to be transformed by communion with God. Those who spend time in His presence cannot help but reflect His glory. The shining face also served as a powerful reminder to the people of Moses' unique role as mediator. While they had been making golden calves, Moses had been in the presence of the living God. While they had been rebelling, he had been interceding. While they had been breaking covenant, he had been receiving grace. The light on his face was evidence of his authority and authenticity as God's spokesman. Moses returned to the mountain to receive the law again, this time on new tablets of stone. God wrote the commandments a second time, demonstrating His willingness to renew the covenant despite their rebellion. But this renewal came with deeper understanding of God's character. As Moses stood with the new tablets, God proclaimed His name, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and the fourth generation. This revelation of God's character became one of the most quoted passages in the Old Testament. It showed the perfect balance between mercy and justice, love and holiness, forgiveness and accountability. Moses was learning to lead people in relationship with a God who is both incredibly patient and ultimately just, both wonderfully forgiving and absolutely holy. The renewed covenant included detailed instructions for the construction of the tabernacle, a portable sanctuary that would travel with the Israelites through the wilderness and into the Promised Land. This was not just a building, but a symbol of God's desire to dwell among His people, to be accessible for worship and consultation, despite His transcendent holiness. Moses oversaw every detail of the tabernacle's construction with meticulous care. The materials were all provided by voluntary offerings from the people, so generous that Moses had to restrain them from giving more. This enthusiasm for giving to God's house was a sign of their renewed commitment after the golden calf incident. They wanted to demonstrate their loyalty through sacrificial generosity. The tabernacle itself was a masterpiece of symbolic theology. Every element pointed to spiritual truth about God's character and His relationship with His people. The bronze altar spoke of the necessity of sacrifice for sin. The bronze laver reminded the priests of the need for cleansing. The table of showbread represented God's provision. The golden lampstand symbolized divine light and guidance. The altar of incense pictured the prayers of the people rising to God. At the heart of the tabernacle was the most holy place containing the Ark of the Covenant. This golden chest held the tablets of the law, Aaron's rod that budded, and a pot of manna, symbols of God's commands, His choice of leadership, and His provision. The mercy seat on top of the ark was where God's presence would dwell, and where blood would be sprinkled on the Day of Atonement for the forgiveness of sin. When the tabernacle was finally completed and set up according to God's instructions, something extraordinary happened. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. God had come to dwell among His people in a visible, undeniable way. The same glory that had appeared on Mount Sinai now resided in the midst of the camp. This was the fulfillment of God's promise. I will dwell among the people of Israel, and will be their God. And they shall know that I am the Lord their God, who brought them out of the land of Egypt, that I might dwell among them. The cloud by day and fire by night that had led them from Egypt now settled on the tabernacle. When the cloud lifted, the people would break camp and follow. When it remained, they would stay where they were. This was divine guidance made visible and practical, God Himself directing their movements through the wilderness. Moses' role as leader was now firmly established and clearly defined. He was the mediator between God and the people, the one who entered the tabernacle to receive instructions and emerged to communicate God's will. He was the shepherd who led them according to divine guidance, the judge who settled disputes according to divine law, the intercessor who stood between them and God's judgment. But Moses was also learning that leadership of God's people involves constant challenges to authority and frequent tests of faith. The wilderness would prove to be not just a geographical journey, but a spiritual testing ground where both leader and people would be refined like gold in a furnace. The complaints that had begun with bitter water and lack of food continued in various forms throughout their wilderness wandering. At Kibroth Hattava, the people complained about the manna and craved the meat they had eaten in Egypt. God gave them quail in such abundance that they were sick of it, but many died from overeating. The place was named Graves of Craving because they buried those who had been greedy there. Moses found himself overwhelmed by the constant complaints and demands of the people. In his frustration, he cried out to God, "Why have you dealt ill with your servant? And why have I not found favor in your sight, that you lay the burden of all this people on me? Did I conceive all this people? Did I give them birth, that you should say to me, 'Carry them in your bosom, as a nurse carries a nursing child, to the land that you swore to give their fathers?'" This was Moses at his most human. Exhausted, frustrated, feeling alone in leadership, wondering why God had given him such a difficult assignment. His complaint revealed the weight that spiritual leadership places on those who bear it. It also showed that even the greatest leaders have moments of discouragement and need divine encouragement to continue. God's response was both practical and compassionate. He told Moses to gather 70 elders of Israel, men who were known as leaders and officers among the people. God would take some of the spirit that was on Moses and put it on them so they could share the burden of leadership. This was not a diminishing of Moses' authority, but a multiplication of his effectiveness through others. When the Spirit came upon the 70 elders, they prophesied, spoke under divine inspiration as a sign that God had indeed empowered them for leadership. 2 of the elders, Eldad and Medad, were not present at the tabernacle when this happened, but the Spirit came upon them in the camp, and they too prophesied. Joshua, concerned about proper order, asked Moses to stop them. Moses' response revealed his growth in secure leadership. "Are you jealous for my sake? Would that all the Lord's people were prophets, that the Lord would put his Spirit on them." Moses was not threatened by others, being empowered by God. He understood that multiplication of leadership was essential for the welfare of the people and the accomplishment of God's purposes. The sharing of leadership burden brought some relief to Moses, but it did not eliminate all challenges. His own family provided the next test when Miriam and Aaron spoke against him because of the Cushite woman he had married. Their complaint seemed to be about Moses' interracial marriage, but their real issue was with his unique authority. Has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also? This challenge to Moses' leadership was particularly painful because it came from his own siblings, the very people who had supported him from the beginning. Miriam had watched over him as a baby in the Nile. Aaron had been his spokesman before Pharaoh. Now they were undermining his authority and questioning his special relationship with God. God's response was swift and decisive. He called all 3 of them to the tent of meeting and spoke to them directly. "Hear my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision. I speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak mouth to mouth, clearly, and not in riddles, and he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?" The distinction was clear. Other prophets received revelation through visions and dreams, but Moses communed with God directly, face to face. His authority was not based on position or politics, but on his unique relationship with God. To challenge Moses was to challenge God himself. As a consequence of their rebellion, Miriam was struck with leprosy, her skin becoming white as snow. This was not arbitrary punishment, but a symbolic consequence. She, who had spoken against God's chosen servant, was marked with the disease that made one ceremonially unclean and excluded from the community. Aaron, seeing what had happened to his sister, immediately confessed their sin and pleaded with Moses for mercy. Moses' response revealed the heart of a true leader. Despite being attacked and undermined by his own sister, he immediately interceded for her. "O God, please heal her, please." His prayer was brief but heartfelt, showing that he bore no grudge against those who had wronged him. This was the kind of love that forgives enemies, and prays for those who persecute. God heard Moses' prayer and healed Miriam, but she had to remain outside the camp for 7 days, according to the law regarding leprosy. The entire nation waited for her during this time, showing their respect for Moses' family and their understanding that God's discipline, though sometimes severe, is always redemptive in purpose. The incident with Miriam and Aaron taught Moses another crucial lesson about leadership. Even those closest to you may sometimes become your greatest challengers. Family relationships, personal history, and past loyalty do not guarantee future support. But the leader who maintains integrity and continues to love and intercede for his opponents will ultimately be vindicated by God. As the Israelites approached the borders of the Promised Land, Moses faced perhaps his greatest leadership challenge yet. From Kadesh Barnea, he sent 12 spies, one from each tribe, to scout out the land of Canaan. These were not ordinary men, but leaders, heads of tribes, representatives of the people. Their mission was to bring back information about the land, its inhabitants, and its cities. After 40 days, the spies returned with evidence of the land's incredible fertility. They brought back a cluster of grapes so large it had to be carried on a pole between 2 men, along with pomegranates and figs. Their report confirmed what God had promised. "We came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit." But 10 of the 12 spies also brought a discouraging report about the inhabitants. "However, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there." The Anakim were giants legendary for their size and strength. The spies described themselves as grasshoppers in comparison to these formidable enemies. Only 2 of the spies, Caleb and Joshua, brought a report of faith. Caleb spoke up boldly, "Let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it." But the majority report carried the day, and fear spread through the camp like wildfire. The people began to say, "Would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become a prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt?" This was the crisis that would define Moses' entire ministry. After all the miracles they had witnessed, the plagues, the Red Sea crossing the provision in the wilderness, the giving of the law, the people were ready to abandon God's promises because of fear. They were willing to trade the promised land for the familiar slavery of Egypt, rather than face the challenges that lay ahead. The people's rebellion reached its peak when they said to one another, "Let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt." This was not just rejection of the promised land, it was rejection of Moses' leadership and ultimately rejection of God Himself. They were ready to undo everything God had accomplished in bringing them out of bondage. Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before the assembly, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the people's unbelief. Joshua and Caleb tore their clothes in anguish and made one final appeal. "The land which we pass through to spy it out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, He will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land that flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their protection is removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them." But instead of listening to this call to faith, the people picked up stones to stone Joshua and Caleb. They were ready to kill the very men who brought them God's perspective on their situation. At that moment, when mob violence was about to erupt, the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting before all the people. God's anger burned against the people's persistent unbelief. Once again, he offered to destroy them and make Moses into a great nation. But once again, Moses interceded for the people who had rejected both him and God. His prayer was a masterpiece of intercession, appealing to God's reputation among the nations and his character as revealed at Sinai. Now, if you kill this people as one man, then the nations who have heard your fame will say, "It is because the Lord was not able to bring this people into the land that he swore to give to them, that he has killed them in the wilderness." And now, please, let the power of the Lord be great, as you have promised, saying, "The Lord is slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity and transgression, but he will by no means clear the guilty." Please pardon the iniquity of this people according to the greatness of your steadfast love, just as you have forgiven this people from Egypt until now. God heard Moses' prayer and pardoned the people, but not without consequences. The generation that had rejected his promises would not enter the promised land. They would wander in the wilderness for 40 years, 1 year for each day. The spies had scouted the land until all the adults who had participated in this rebellion had died. Only their children, along with Caleb and Joshua, would inherit the promises. This judgment was both merciful and just. Merciful because the people were not destroyed immediately as their rebellion deserved. Just because unbelief has consequences, and those who refuse to trust God's promises cannot inherit his blessings. The wilderness would become their tomb, but it would also become their children's training ground. The 40 years that followed were a long, slow lesson in the consequences of unbelief and the necessity of trusting God completely. Moses, now in his 80s, had to lead a nation of wanderers going in circles in the desert, waiting for an entire generation to die off. It was not the ministry he had envisioned when God first called him at the burning bush. During these wilderness years, Moses faced repeated challenges to his authority. The most serious came from Korah, a Levite who was joined by Dathan and Abiram from the tribe of Reuben, along with 250 leaders of the congregation. Their complaint was cloaked in religious language, "You have gone too far. For all in the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Why then do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord?" This was a challenge not just to Moses' leadership, but to the very principle of divinely appointed authority. Korah and his followers were essentially arguing for democracy over theocracy, claiming that all the people were equally holy and therefore equally qualified to lead. It sounded spiritual and egalitarian, but it was actually rebellion against God's chosen order. Moses' response showed both his humility and his confidence in God's calling. "In the morning the Lord will show who is his, and who is holy, and will bring him near to him. The one whom he chooses, he will bring near to him." Moses proposed a test. Let Korah and his followers offer incense before the Lord, and God would show whom he had chosen. The next day, when the test was conducted, God's judgment was swift and dramatic. The ground opened up and swallowed Korah, Dathan, and Abiram alive, along with their households and possessions. Fire came out from the Lord and consumed the 250 men who had offered unauthorized incense. It was a terrifying demonstration that God takes the matter of spiritual authority seriously. But even after this dramatic vindication of Moses' leadership, the people complained the next day, "You have killed the people of the Lord." Their continued rebellion brought a plague that killed 14,700 people before Aaron ran into the midst of the congregation with a censer of incense, making atonement and stopping the plague. To settle the question of priestly authority once and for all, God commanded that 12 rods, one from each tribe, be placed in the tent of meeting overnight. The rod of the man God had chosen would sprout. Aaron's rod not only sprouted, but budded, blossomed, and produced ripe almonds, a complete cycle of life, demonstrating God's choice of the Levitical priesthood. These incidents taught Moses that leadership of God's people will always face challenges, often from within the community itself. Those who are called to lead must be prepared for opposition, criticism, and even outright rebellion. But they must also trust that God will vindicate His chosen servants in His own time and way. As the 40 years of wilderness wandering drew to a close, Moses himself faced his greatest personal failure as a leader. The people were once again complaining about water at a place called Meribah. God told Moses to speak to a rock before the assembly, and it would yield its water. But Moses, frustrated by 40 years of complaints and rebellions, let his anger get the better of him. Instead of speaking to the rock as God commanded Moses, struck it twice with his staff, saying, "Hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock?" Water came out abundantly, and the people's thirst was satisfied. But Moses had disobeyed God's specific instructions, and in his anger had seemed to take credit for the miracle himself. God's response was heartbreaking. "Because you did not trust in me to uphold my holiness before the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them." After 40 years of faithful leadership, after interceding countless times for ungrateful people, after bearing their complaints and rebellions with patience, Moses would not be allowed to enter the promised land because of this one act of disobedience. This was perhaps the most painful consequence Moses ever faced. His life's work had been leading Israel to the promised land, and now he would die within sight of it, but never set foot in it. The judgment seemed harsh for what appeared to be a relatively minor infraction, but it demonstrated that those in leadership are held to higher standards, and that even faithful servants are not exempt from the consequences of disobedience. Moses' response to this devastating news revealed the depth of his character. He did not argue with God, did not claim the punishment was unfair, did not become bitter or resentful. Instead, he accepted God's judgment and continued faithfully in his calling, preparing the people and their next leader for the challenges ahead. As Moses' time drew to a close, he focused his energy on preparing Israel for life in the promised land and ensuring a smooth transition of leadership to Joshua. The book of Deuteronomy records his final speeches to the people, a masterful review of their history, a restatement of God's laws, and passionate appeals for faithfulness to the covenant. In these final addresses, Moses revealed his heart as both teacher and shepherd. He reminded the people of all God had done for them, warned them against the temptations they would face in the land, and called them to choose life by obeying God's commandments. His words were those of a father speaking to his children, knowing he would not be with them much longer. Moses also took great care in preparing Joshua for leadership. He publicly commissioned him, laying hands on him and transferring authority before all the people. He encouraged Joshua with the same words God had spoken to him years earlier. "Be strong and courageous, for you shall go with this people into the land that the Lord has sworn to their fathers to give them, and you shall put them in possession of it." On his final day, Moses climbed Mount Nebo, which overlooks the Promised Land. There, alone with God, he looked out over the land of promise, a land flowing with milk and honey, a land where God's people would build cities and plant vineyards, a land where the covenant promises would find their fulfillment. His eyes were undimmed and his vigor unabated at 120 years old, but his earthly ministry was complete. The Bible records simply, "So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord, and he buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor. But no one knows the place of his burial to this day." God himself buried Moses, hiding his grave, so it would never become a site of idolatrous worship. Even in death, Moses was protected from the tendency of people to worship the servant rather than the master. The assessment of Moses' life given in Scripture is unparalleled. And there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, none like him, for all the signs and the wonders that the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt to Pharaoh, and to all his servants, and to all his land, and for all the mighty power and all the great deeds of terror that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. But Moses' greatest legacy was not the miracles he performed or the laws he delivered. It was the foundation he laid for understanding what it means to live in relationship with the Holy God. Through the tabernacle and its sacrificial system, he established the principle that sinful people can approach Holy God only through substitutionary atonement. Through the priesthood, he demonstrated the need for mediation between God and humanity. Through the law, he revealed God's character and his standards for human behavior. Moses' life also established the pattern of servant leadership that would culminate in Christ. Like Jesus, Moses was a deliverer who came to set his people free. Like Jesus, he was a mediator who stood between God and sinful humanity. Like Jesus, he was a shepherd who laid down his life for the sheep. Like Jesus, he was a prophet who spoke God's words faithfully, regardless of the cost. The New Testament makes these connections explicit. Jesus is called a prophet like Moses in Acts 3:22. The writer of Hebrews compares Moses and Jesus, concluding that Jesus has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, while still honoring Moses as faithful in all God's house as a servant. Paul writes that the rock that provided water in the wilderness was Christ, showing how Moses' ministry pointed forward to the ultimate reality found in Jesus. For us today, Moses remains one of the most relevant figures in all of Scripture. His story speaks to anyone who has ever felt inadequate for the task God has given them. When Moses said, "Who am I?" at the burning bush, he was expressing what many of us feel when faced with seemingly impossible challenges. But God's response then is the same as his response, "Now, I will be with you." Moses' journey from palace to desert to deliverer shows us that God often prepares his servants through seasons of obscurity and difficulty. The 40 years Moses spent as a shepherd in Midian were not wasted time, but essential preparation for leading God's people through the wilderness. Our own seasons of waiting, of apparent inactivity, of hidden preparation, may be God's way of equipping us for future service. The leadership principles demonstrated in Moses' life remain as relevant today as they were 3,500 years ago. True leadership begins with a call from God, not personal ambition. It requires humility to listen to advice from others, as Moses listened to Jethro. It demands the courage to make unpopular decisions when they align with God's will. It involves sharing authority with others rather than trying to control everything personally. Moses' role as intercessor provides a powerful model for spiritual leadership today. Time and again he stood between God's justice and the people's sin, pleading for mercy and forgiveness. This kind of intercession, sacrificial prayer for others, especially those who may not deserve it, is one of the highest callings of spiritual leadership. The story of Moses also teaches us about the nature of faith itself. True faith is not the absence of questions or doubts, but the willingness to obey God despite our fears and uncertainties. Moses questioned God at the burning bush, expressed frustration during the wilderness years, and sometimes acted in anger rather than perfect trust. Yet he is remembered as one of the great heroes of faith because he continued to follow God's leading despite his human weaknesses. Moses' experience with the golden calf incident shows us that even the most dramatic spiritual experiences do not guarantee continued faithfulness. The people who had just heard God speak from Mount Sinai were ready to worship an idol within weeks. This reminds us that spiritual formation is a process, not a single event, and that we must guard our hearts against the subtle temptations that can lead us away from wholehearted devotion to God. The 40 years of wilderness wandering illustrate an important principle about God's dealing with His people. Sometimes the journey to our promised land takes much longer than we expect, not because God is slow to fulfill His promises, but because we need time to be prepared for what He has in store for us. The Israelites needed to learn dependence on God, develop new patterns of thinking, and raise a generation that had never known slavery before they could successfully possess the land of promise. Moses' failure at Meribah and its severe consequences reminds us that leadership brings increased responsibility and accountability. Those who are given much are required to give much in return. But even Moses' failure was used by God to point forward to a greater truth that the law cannot bring us into our ultimate promised land of eternal life with God. Only the grace of God in Christ can accomplish what the law and even the greatest human leaders cannot do. The fact that Moses was not allowed to enter the promised land despite his 40 years of faithful service teaches us that our ultimate reward is not found in earthly accomplishments, but in faithful service to God, regardless of the outcome. Moses died satisfied because he had completed the work God gave him to do. Even though he didn't see all the results, he had hoped for. For those facing their own Red Sea moments, times when the way forward seems impossible and enemies are pursuing from behind, Moses' example provides both encouragement and instruction. The key is not to focus on the impossibility of the situation, but on the reliability of God's character and promises. When Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, he wasn't sure what would happen, but he trusted that God would be faithful to his word. Moses' transformation from reluctant leader to confident servant of God shows us that growth in spiritual maturity is possible for anyone willing to submit to God's training process. The man who once said, "I am not eloquent," became one of the greatest communicators in history. The man who killed an Egyptian in anger learned to intercede patiently for those who wronged him. The man who fled from responsibility became the archetypal servant leader. The tabernacle that Moses built according to God's instructions teaches us that God desires to dwell among his people. The elaborate symbolism of the tabernacle, from the bronze altar to the mercy seat, all pointed forward to the ultimate reality of God dwelling among us in the person of Jesus Christ. Today, through the Holy Spirit, believers themselves become the temple of God, carrying his presence wherever they go. Moses' role as lawgiver established principles of justice, mercy, and social responsibility that have influenced legal systems and moral thinking for millennia. The Ten Commandments remain as relevant today as they were when first given, providing a foundation for human relationships and social order. But Moses himself understood that external law, however good, cannot change the human heart. He looked forward to a day when God would make a new covenant, writing his law on human hearts rather than on tablets of stone. The prayer of Moses, recorded in Psalm 90, gives us insight into his mature perspective on life. Teach us to number our days, that we may get a heart of wisdom. Moses understood that life is brief, and that wisdom comes from recognizing our dependence on God and aligning our priorities with his eternal purposes. This perspective enabled him to invest his life in things that would outlast his earthly existence. Moses' humility, described as being greater than anyone else on earth, was not self-deprecation, but an accurate assessment of his relationship to God. True humility recognizes that any abilities, opportunities, or accomplishments we have are gifts from God to be used for his glory rather than our own. This humility made Moses an effective leader because people could trust that he was not seeking his own advantage, but their welfare. The succession from Moses to Joshua demonstrates the importance of leadership transition and legacy. Moses invested time and energy in preparing his successor, ensuring that the work of God would continue beyond his own lifetime. This principle applies to parents preparing their children, pastors training future leaders, and anyone in a position of responsibility thinking about who will carry on their work. Moses' final blessings on the tribes of Israel, recorded in Deuteronomy 33, shows his heart as a spiritual father who wanted to leave his people with words of encouragement and hope. Even though they had often disappointed and frustrated him, his final words were of blessing rather than condemnation. This demonstrates the kind of leadership that builds up rather than tears down, that encourages rather than discourages. The mountain where Moses died, Mount Nebo, became a place of vision and promise. From there, he could see the land his people would inherit, even though he could not enter it himself. Sometimes God calls his servants to work for results they will not personally experience, to plant trees whose shade they will never enjoy. This requires a perspective that values God's glory and his people's welfare above personal satisfaction. The mystery surrounding Moses' burial place teaches us something important about how we should remember great leaders. While we honor their memory and learn from their example, we must not turn human servants into objects of worship. Our ultimate allegiance belongs to God alone, and even the greatest human leaders are merely instruments in his hands. As we conclude this journey through Moses' extraordinary life, we return to the question we posed at the beginning. What if you knew you were born to change history? Moses' story provides the answer. You don't need to be perfect, just available. You don't need to have all the answers, just willingness to follow God's leading. You don't need extraordinary natural abilities, just surrender to God's extraordinary power working through you. Moses began as a man with significant flaws, a murderer, a fugitive, someone who felt inadequate for the task God was calling him to. But through his willingness to say yes to God's call, despite his fears and limitations, he became the human instrument through whom God accomplished one of the greatest acts of deliverance in human history. The same God who called Moses from a burning bush, who parted the Red Sea, who provided manna in the wilderness, who gave the law from Mount Sinai, who dwelt among his people in the tabernacle, that same God is at work in the world today. He is still calling ordinary people to do extraordinary things. He is still looking for those who will trust him when the way forward is unclear. He is still powerful to deliver, to provide, to guide, and to transform lives. Your burning bush may not be a literal bush in the desert, but God has ways of getting our attention when he has work for us to do. Your Red Sea may not be a body of water, but there will be times when you must choose between trusting God's promises and accepting apparent impossibilities. Your wilderness may not be a physical desert, but there will be seasons of preparation, testing, and dependence on God's daily provision. The message of Moses' life is ultimately a message of hope. If God could use a stuttering shepherd to become the liberator of nations, if he could transform a reluctant leader into the lawgiver of civilization, if he could work through someone with such obvious flaws to accomplish such eternal purposes, then he can certainly use you. Perhaps you've been waiting for years for God to use you in significant ways. Perhaps you've wondered if your failures and weaknesses have disqualified you from meaningful service. Perhaps you've questioned whether you have anything valuable to offer to God's kingdom. Moses' story reminds us that God specializes in using broken people to accomplish his perfect purposes. The key is not in becoming perfect before we serve, but in being willing to serve despite our imperfections. It's not in having all our questions answered before we step out in faith, but in trusting God's character when his ways are unclear. It's not in feeling confident in our own abilities, but in being confident in God's ability to work through our weaknesses. Moses' staff, which began as a simple shepherd's rod, became the instrument through which God worked miracles. What ordinary thing in your life might God want to use in extraordinary ways? What simple gift, what modest ability, what seemingly insignificant opportunity might become the tool through which God blesses many. The greatest miracle in Moses' story was not the parting of the Red Sea or the provision of manna in the wilderness, though those were certainly extraordinary displays of divine power. The greatest miracle was the transformation of Moses himself from a man who said, "Who am I?" to one who could stand before the mightiest ruler on earth and say, "Thus says the Lord." From someone who felt he couldn't speak to someone whose words are still studied and quoted thousands of years later. From a person running away from responsibility to one who was willing to sacrifice his own eternal destiny for the sake of others. This same transformative power is available to anyone who, like Moses, is willing to encounter God at their own burning bush and say, "Here I am, send me." The God who met Moses in the wilderness is the same God who meets us in our own places of obscurity and preparation. The God who called Moses to impossible tasks is the same God who invites us to trust Him for things beyond our natural abilities. Your story may not be finished. In fact, like Moses, your greatest chapters may still be ahead of you. The delays you've experienced may have been preparation, not punishment. The difficulties you've faced may have been training, not abandonment. The dreams that have seemed impossible may be invitations to trust God for the miraculous. Moses' life teaches us that with God, it's never too late for a new beginning. He was 80 years old when God called him to his greatest work. Your age, your background, your past failures, your present circumstances, none of these factors can limit what God can do through a surrendered life. The sea that seems to block your path may be about to become your miracle. The wilderness that feels like wandering may be God's classroom for your next assignment. The complaints and criticisms of others may be the very experiences that develop your character for greater service. Remember Moses when you feel inadequate for what God is calling you to do. Remember his transformation when you wonder if you can really change. Remember his faithful intercession when you're tempted to give up on difficult people. Remember his willingness to sacrifice for others when you're focused on your own needs and desires. Most of all, remember that the same God who was with Moses is with you. The same power that worked through Moses is available to work through you. The same faithfulness that sustained Moses through 40 years of wilderness leadership will sustain you through whatever challenges lie ahead. The story of Moses is ultimately not about Moses. It's about God. It's about a God who hears the cries of the oppressed, who remembers his promises, who calls ordinary people to participate in his extraordinary work. It's about a God whose power is made perfect in human weakness, whose glory is displayed through humble servants, whose purposes are accomplished through those who trust him completely. This same God is looking for people today who will respond as Moses finally did, not perfectly, not without questions, not without struggles, but with a willingness to follow wherever he leads. He's looking for people who will stretch out their hands toward impossible situations and trust him to work miracles. He's looking for people who will intercede for others, even when those others seem undeserving. He's looking for people who will value his glory above their own comfort and his purposes above their own plans. The question is not whether God can use you. The question is whether you will let him. The question is not whether you are qualified. The question is whether you are available. The question is not whether you understand everything about His plan. The question is whether you trust His character enough to take the next step He shows you. Moses discovered that when we make ourselves available to God, He makes His power available to us. When we trust His promises, He makes His presence our companion. When we surrender our limitations, He works through them to accomplish the impossible. Your Red Sea is waiting. Your burning bush encounter may be closer than you think. Your greatest days of serving God and blessing others may still be ahead of you. The same God who said to Moses, "I will be with you," is saying the same thing to you today. Are you ready to stretch out your hand and see what God will do? Imagine standing before a wall of water towering dozens of meters high behind you. A ruthless army in pursuit around you. 2 million people looking at you with desperate eyes. In that moment, what would you do? Run, plead, or step forward and believe that the impossible could become possible? This was the defining moment of a man who was once an Egyptian prince, then became a fugitive in the desert, and finally became the one chosen by God to liberate a nation. Moses, a name that has become the symbol of unshakable faith and divine power. But Moses was not born a hero. He was once afraid, once refused his mission, once doubted himself. So, what transformed an ordinary man into the greatest leader in human history? And more importantly, could his story change your life? Today, we will dive deep into this extraordinary journey, not just as a historical account, but as a living mirror of how God can use anyone at any time to accomplish things beyond our wildest imagination. Egypt, during Moses' time, was not just a nation, it was the superpower of the ancient world. Pyramids soared toward heaven. Magnificent palaces displayed the absolute power of Pharaoh, the king who was considered the incarnation of the gods. But beneath that glittering veneer of gold lay a dark reality, millions of slaves living in suffering and despair. 400 years earlier, their ancestors had come to Egypt as honored guests, welcomed with great ceremony thanks to Joseph. But time had erased the memory of their contributions. Exodus 1:8 records, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph." Just one simple sentence, but it was the beginning of a tragedy that lasted for centuries. Pharaoh didn't just make the Israelites slaves, he feared their potential power. "The people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us." These words reflected the tyrant's fear. His solution was brutal: kill every Hebrew boy at birth. Midwives were given secret orders to murder male babies as soon as they were born. But this was not just a physical crisis. It was a profound spiritual crisis. The Israelites began to forget the God of their fathers. Some among them even began to worship Egyptian gods. Psalm 106, 21-22 describes, "They forgot God their Savior, who had done great things in Egypt, wondrous works in the land of Ham." For 400 years, heaven seemed silent. No prophets, no miracles, no voice from above. Many began to doubt. Did the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob still remember them? Were the promises from long ago still valid? With each passing day, hope grew dimmer. Children were born in chains, aged in chains, and died in chains. It was not just physical slavery, it was slavery of the soul. They began to believe this was fate that there would never be change. But God was preparing. Exodus 2:24-25 writes, God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. In the silence of history, a rescue plan was being conceived, and the one to execute that plan would emerge from where no one expected. In 1526 BC, while the decree to kill Hebrew children was being strictly enforced, a baby boy was born into the family of Amram and Jochebed of the tribe of Levi. Exodus 2:2 records, the woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was fine, she hid him 3 months. The word fine in Hebrew is tov, the same word God used when seeing his creation work. 3 months passed, hiding the child became impossible. Jochebed faced the most cruel decision a mother could encounter: kill her child or set him adrift on the river. She chose to trust in God. She placed the child in a small basket waterproofed with pitch and set it on the Nile River, where the Egyptian princess regularly came to bathe. A miracle happened exactly according to God's plan. The princess found the child, compassion arose in her heart, and thanks to the cleverness of Miriam, Moses' sister, the child was returned to nurse with his birth mother, but was raised in Pharaoh's palace. Acts 7:21-22 says, and when he was exposed, Pharaoh's daughter adopted him and brought him up as her own son. And Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in his words and deeds. Moses grew up with supreme privilege. He was educated by Egypt's leading scholars, well-versed in tactics, law, architecture, and even the deepest religious secrets. Historian Josephus recorded that Moses had once been an outstanding general, leading the Egyptian army to victory over the Ethiopians. He could have become the next Pharaoh, but God had planted in Moses' heart an awareness of his true identity. Hebrews 11:24-25 writes, by faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. When Moses was 40 years old, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. Righteous anger flared up. He killed the Egyptian and hid the body in the sand. But this was not kept secret. Pharaoh issued a warrant for his arrest, and Moses had to flee Egypt, from prince to fugitive. Moses found his way to Midian, a desolate land in the desert. There he rescued the daughters of the priest Jethro from aggressive shepherds. Jethro invited him to stay, and Moses married Zipporah, Jethro's daughter. From a powerful prince, he became a quiet shepherd. 40 long years in the desert were not wasted time. It was God's school. Moses learned humility, learned to listen to God's voice in silence, learned to lead flocks through treacherous paths. Numbers 12:3 describes, now the man Moses was very meek, more than all people who were on the face of the earth. When Moses was 80 years old on Mount Horeb, the unthinkable happened. A bush burned, but was not consumed. From within it, God's voice spoke, Moses, Moses. And Moses answered, here I am. This was the moment that changed not just Moses' life, but the flow of human history. God declared, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses was not enthusiastic to jump in. He gave 5 reasons to refuse. Who am I? They will not believe. I am not eloquent. Please send someone else. These reasons were not false humility. They were the real fears of someone who had once failed. But this was exactly why God chose Moses. Not because he was perfect, but because he knew he needed to depend on God. Moses returned to Egypt not as a confident hero, but as a man full of anxiety. He had requested Aaron, his brother, to be his spokesman because he felt inadequate in eloquence. This shows Moses was not a supernatural character from the beginning. He was a human being with real weaknesses. When Moses and Aaron walked into the palace, they carried a simple but bold message. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go. Pharaoh Ramesses II, ruler of the world's mightiest empire at that time, responded with mocking laughter, Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go. Pharaoh's reaction was not just refusal. He made life harder for the Israelites. They had to find their own straw to make bricks, but the quota of bricks remained the same. The people turned against Moses. The Lord look on you and judge, because you have made us stink in the sight of Pharaoh and his servants, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us. Moses felt confused and disappointed. He cried out to God, O Lord, why have you done evil to this people? Why did you ever send me? God did not rebuke Moses for his doubt. Instead, he reaffirmed his promise and revealed his holy name. I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I also established my covenant with them. I have heard the groaning of the people of Israel, and I have remembered my covenant. This was when Moses began to understand that this battle was not between him and Pharaoh, but between the true God and the false gods of Egypt. What happened next was not just a series of random disasters. It was a systematic declaration of war against the entire Egyptian religious system. Each plague targeted a specific god. The first plague, water turned to blood, targeted Hapi, god of the Nile River. The Nile was considered Egypt's lifeline, but now it became stinking blood. The second plague, frogs attacked Heket, the frog-headed goddess of fertility. Frogs went from symbols of life to become a curse. The third plague, gnats. The Egyptian magicians could not replicate this and had to admit, this is the finger of God. Through each plague we see Moses growing in faith. Initially, he still doubted, but now he declared to Pharaoh with confidence, Tomorrow I will stretch out my hands to the Lord. The thunder will cease, and there will be no more hail, so that you may know that the earth is the Lord's. The ninth plague, darkness. This was a direct attack on Ra, Egypt's supreme sun god. For 3 days all Egypt was plunged in darkness that could be felt. But where the Israelites lived, there was light. Pharaoh began to waver, but his heart remained hardened. God announced to Moses the final plague, the death of the firstborn. This was not just punishment, but divine justice. Pharaoh had killed the Hebrew firstborn sons. Now his own son and all Egypt's firstborn would pay the price. But before the final plague occurred, God gave the Israelites a profound lesson about grace through the Passover. Each family had to kill an unblemished lamb and put blood on the door frames. When I see the blood, I will pass over you. This was not based on whether they were Hebrew or Egyptian, but on whether there was blood for protection. Through these months, we witness an amazing transformation in Moses' character. From a timid shepherd, he became God's representative before the world's mightiest king. He learned that power comes not from personal ability, but from obedience to God. One notable thing is that God did not destroy Pharaoh immediately. He gave him many chances to repent. Romans 9:17 explains, "For the Scripture says to Pharaoh, 'For this very purpose I have raised you up, that I might show my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth.'" God wanted not just to rescue Israel, but to show the whole world that He is the only Lord. With each time Pharaoh refused Moses' faith was forged further. He learned to trust completely in God's timing, no matter how difficult circumstances became. This was the necessary preparation for the greater challenges waiting ahead. On the night of the 14th of the first month, all Egypt sank into uneasy sleep. The Israelites stayed awake, staff in hand sandals, on feet belts, fastened, waiting. They had eaten the Passover lamb according to God's command. Blood had been applied to the door frames. At midnight, the most terrible thing in Egypt's history happened. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. The sound of weeping echoed throughout the land, from palace to the poorest hut. Even Pharaoh, the king who had considered himself a god, had to hold his son's corpse and weep like an ordinary father. In the middle of the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron. The man who had once declared, "I do not know the Lord," now pleaded, "Up, go out from among my people, both you and the people of Israel, and go serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also." Note the last words, "Bless me also." Pharaoh finally recognized the power of the God of Israel. Early morning on the 15th of the first month, the unbelievable happened. More than 2 million Israelites, including elderly children, pregnant women, newborns, along with millions of livestock, began the journey out of Egypt. They were not just freed, they were even voluntarily given gold, silver, and expensive clothing by the Egyptians as wages for 430 years of slavery. But liberation from Egypt was just the beginning. Moses now faced a much greater challenge, leading 2 million people through the barren desert. This was not a disciplined army, but a collection of families, including the elderly and children. How could food, water, and shelter be provided for such a massive number in the desert? But God did not leave Moses alone. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. This was not just practical guidance, but a symbol of God's continuous presence. But after the pain of losing his son subsided, the lust for power and pride rose again in Pharaoh's heart. He realized he had just released a huge labor force, the backbone of the empire's economy. What have we done that we have let Israel go from serving us? He mobilized 600 of his best chariots along with all cavalry and infantry. the most formidable military force of the age. God had led the Israelites to what seemed like a death trap ahead was the vast Red Sea. On both sides were towering rocky mountains, behind was the vast desert. When the sound of horse hooves and chariot wheels of the Egyptian army rang out from behind, panic erupted among the people. This was the ultimate test moment, not just for Israel, but for Moses himself. The people turned to Moses with bitter words. "Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians, for it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." This was perhaps the darkest moment in Moses' life. He not only had to face the world's strongest enemy, but also bear resentment from the very people he was trying to save. The loneliness of leadership was fully revealed. When everyone was afraid and blamed others, only Moses had to stand firm and seek God. The Bible does not record the details, but surely Moses cried out to God in desperation. Perhaps he asked, "Lord, I have obeyed you. Why have you brought me to this place? Is this the end?" These are the moments when faith is truly tested by fire, not when everything goes smoothly, but when God seems silent and the situation hopeless. But God was not silent. He spoke to Moses. "Why do you cry to me? Tell the people of Israel to go forward. Lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the people of Israel may go through the sea on dry ground." Note that God did not blame Moses for his anxiety, but he demanded action in faith. Imagine this moment from Moses' perspective. Before him was a wall of water, dozens of meters high behind him, the sound of horse hooves and shouts of the Egyptian army approaching. 2 million people were staring at him, and God told him to stretch out his hand toward the sea. What if nothing happened? What if God did not intervene? This was the ultimate test of faith, trusting completely without seeing the outcome. Moses might have hesitated for a second, but then he did what only faith could do. He stepped forward, stretched out his hand toward the sea, and trusted that God would fulfill his promise. In that moment, Moses was not just a leader, he was a symbol of unshakable faith before impossible things. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. A miracle beyond all imagination happened. Not only did the waters part, but the seabed became dry land, so 2 million people could walk across. This was not just a physical miracle, it was the opening of a new chapter in salvation history. Moses had passed his ultimate test, and now he was ready for the greater mission awaiting him. The moment Moses stepped onto the dry seabed was the moment faith became action. Imagine that scene, 2 towering walls of water on both sides, light filtering through, creating mystical rays, and Moses, the first to dare believe and step forward. Hebrews 11:29 records, "By faith they crossed the Red Sea as on dry land, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned." Not all Israelites were ready to follow Moses immediately. Many were still afraid, looking at the walls of water standing upright by God's power. But Moses did not just give orders. He went first, becoming a living example of faith. Family by family, tribe by tribe, began to follow, until all 2 million people and livestock were walking on the dry seabed. While Israel was moving, God did not let them be attacked. Then the angel of God, who was going before the host of Israel, moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them, coming between the host of Egypt and the host of Israel. The pillar of cloud became darkness for the Egyptians, but gave light to Israel, a clear demonstration of God's distinction. When Pharaoh saw Israel escaping the trap, he made the defining decision of his life. Instead of recognizing God's power, he ordered his entire army to pursue them into the seabed. This was the manifestation of supreme pride. Even in the face of miracle, he still believed military might could overcome divine power. The Egyptians pursued and went in after them into the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. But God had other plans. In the morning watch, God discomfited the Egyptian forces. Wheels got stuck, horses panicked. The Egyptian army began to realize they were fighting against God himself. "Let us flee from before Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians." When all Israel had crossed the sea safely, God told Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots, and upon their horsemen." This was perhaps the most difficult decision Moses had to make. He knew this action would completely destroy the Egyptian army. Human beings he had once lived with, once considered countrymen. But Moses understood this was not personal revenge, but the execution of divine justice. These soldiers represented the oppressive system that had killed thousands of Hebrew children, had enslaved millions of people for 430 years. He stretched out his hand, and the sea water rushed back. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen. Of all the host of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea, not one of them remained. When the sun rose, Israel saw the dead bodies of the Egyptian army on the seashore. This was not a scene to celebrate cruelly, but evidence of God's absolute power. Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians, so the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. In response to this miraculous rescue, Moses led Israel in singing the first victory song in history, "I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my song, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will exalt him." In this moment, Moses' transformation was complete. From an Egyptian prince, he became a fugitive. From a fugitive, he became a shepherd. From a shepherd, he became the greatest liberator in history. But most importantly, he had become a person completely obedient to God's will. The story of parting the Red Sea is not just an ancient miracle. It is a powerful illustration of how faith must be expressed through action. Moses did not just believe, he acted in faith. He did not just pray. He stepped forward when God said to step forward. He did not just hope for miracles, he became part of that miracle. The crossing of the Red Sea also has profound prophetic meaning. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 10:1-2, "For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea." Crossing the Red Sea became a shadow of baptism. the death of the old life, and resurrection into a new life. From this moment, Moses was no longer the hesitant man of before. He had become the leader God intended, one ready to face any challenge because of trust in God's power and promises. When the sound of Egyptian horse hooves was finally silenced forever beneath the Red Sea, a new reality began to emerge. Israel was truly free. After 430 years of slavery, they no longer had to wake up to the sound of whips and shouting. They no longer had to make bricks with insufficient straw. They no longer lived in fear that their sons would be killed. This was freedom that generations had dreamed of, but never dared believe would become reality. But freedom also brought new challenges. The Sinai desert was not an easy place to live. How could 2 million people survive in this harsh environment? The answer lay in God's continuous intervention in ways no one could imagine. Just 3 days after crossing the Red Sea, the people complained about drinking water. At Marah, there was water, but it was bitter and undrinkable. Moses cried out to God, and God showed him a tree. When he threw the tree into the water, the bitter water became sweet. At Rephidim, when there was no water, God told Moses to strike a rock, and water gushed out sufficient for all the people and livestock. The food problem was also solved miraculously. God rained manna from heaven every morning and provided quail in the evening. The people of Israel ate the manna 40 years till they came to a habitable land. They ate the manna till they came to the border of the land of Canaan. This was not just food provision. It was a daily lesson about dependence on God. The challenge came not only from nature, but also from enemies. The Amalekites attacked Israel at Rephidim. Moses sent Joshua to lead the army to battle while he went up the hill with God's staff in his hand. A strange miracle occurred. Whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed, and whenever he lowered his hand, Amalek prevailed. Aaron and Hur had to support Moses' hands until sunset, and Israel won completely. The battle with Amalek taught a profound lesson about Moses' role as intercessor. Victory did not depend on military strength or tactics, but on persistent prayer and faith. Moses learned that his role was not just to give orders, but to stand in the gap between God and the people. When Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came to visit and saw that he had to settle disputes for all the people from morning to evening, he advised, "What you are doing is not good. You and the people with you will certainly wear yourselves out, for the thing is too heavy for you. You are not able to do it alone." Moses accepted the advice and established a system of judges, showing the humility and ability to learn of a true leader. 2 months after leaving Egypt, Israel came to Mount Sinai, where Moses had once met God in the burning bush. But this time, all the people would witness God's presence in a terrifying way. On the morning of the 3rd day, there were thunders and lightnings, and a thick cloud on the mountain, and a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled. On Mount Sinai, Moses received the 10 Commandments, not just laws, but the moral foundation for a just society. This was the first time in human history that a code of law was given directly from God, not from human will. The first 4 commandments related to relationship with God. The last 6 related to relationships between people. Throughout this process, Moses played the role of the sole mediator between God and the people. The people were afraid and said to Moses, "You speak to us, and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us, lest we die." Moses became a shadow of Christ, the only one who could stand between holy God and sinful humanity. But even after the great miracles, Israel still failed. When Moses went up the mountain to receive the law from God and stayed 40 days, the people panicked and asked Aaron to make a golden calf to worship. This was the most heartbreaking betrayal. Right after being rescued from Egypt, they returned to idol worship. When God wanted to destroy Israel and make Moses into a great nation, Moses made the greatest intercessory prayer in the Old Testament: "Turn from your burning anger and relent from this disaster against your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants." Moses was willing to sacrifice himself to save the people. "But now, if you will forgive their sin, but if not, please blot me out of your book that you have written." Finally, God's grace prevailed. Israel was forgiven, the covenant was renewed. Moses went up the mountain again and received new stone tablets. When he came down from the mountain, his face shone so brightly that the Israelites could not look at him. He had to cover his face with a veil. This was evidence of God's presence in Moses' life. All this shows that true victory does not come from human strength, but from faith and obedience. Moses had become a channel for God's power, and through him God accomplished the impossible. When Moses died at age 120 on Mount Nebo, looking down at the promised land, he was not allowed to enter. He left behind a great legacy, not just for Israel, but for all humanity. He was not just a liberator. He was the foundation layer for a civilization based on divine law, social justice, and mercy. The legal system Moses passed down was unlike any legal system in the ancient world. While other nations had different laws for rich and poor, Moses' law declared, "You shall not be partial in judgment. You shall hear the small and the great alike." This is the foundation of the modern judicial system. Moses introduced a revolutionary concept: all human beings are created in God's image. Therefore, all have inherent value. This is clearly shown in laws about cities of refuge for those who killed, accidentally protection of widows and orphans, and especially the command, "You shall love the sojourner as yourself, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt." This is the foundation of modern human rights. Moses became the prototype of servant leadership. Despite having absolute power, he never used his position to enrich himself. He accepted criticism, listened to advice, and was willing to sacrifice for the people. When God wanted to make him into a great nation instead of Israel, he refused and interceded for those who had opposed him. Moses' story teaches us that God does not need perfect people. He needs people willing to obey. Moses had flaws. He was hot-tempered, killed the Egyptian. Not eloquent, asked Aaron to be spokesman, and even did not obey completely. Struck the rock instead of speaking to it. But God used him powerfully. Today, how many people feel they are not good enough for God to use? How many think their past, their flaws, or their failures have excluded them from God's plan? Moses proves that God specializes in turning weakness into strength. Moses did not just believe, he acted in faith. When standing before the Red Sea, he did not just pray but also stretched out his hand toward the sea. When the people thirsted for water, he struck the rock. When Amalek attacked, he held up his hands all day. Faith is not passive emotion. It is the decision to act, even when the path ahead is unclear. In life today, we may encounter our own Red Seas, situations that seem hopeless. The question is not whether God has power, but whether we are willing to stretch out our hands like Moses. That is, act in faith, without knowing the outcome. Moses had to spend 40 years in the desert before being used by God. This was not wasted time, but essential preparation time. In the desert, he learned humility, patience, and how to listen to God's voice. Many people today are going through their own desert period. Seasons when it seems nothing is happening, times when they feel forgotten or unused. But God may be preparing them for a mission greater than they imagine. Moses sacrificed royal life, personal safety, and finally even the opportunity to enter the promised land for his mission. True leadership, whether in family, work, or community, always requires sacrifice. True leaders go first in difficulty and last in glory. Moses failed many times, killed a man, fled, doubted God, and finally was not allowed to enter the promised land for not obeying completely. But each failure became a lesson and preparation for the next step. God does not abandon those who fail. He recreates them. When you feel inadequate for the work God has assigned, remember Moses said, "Who am I?" but still obeyed. When you face obstacles that seem insurmountable, remember Moses standing before the Red Sea and stretching out his hand in faith. When you feel alone in leadership or service, remember Moses standing on the hill with hands raised, supported by Aaron and Hur. When you make mistakes and feel God cannot use you anymore, remember Moses was still called servant of God, despite his flaws. Finally, Moses was not just a historical figure, but also a shadow of Christ. As Moses rescued Israel from physical slavery, Jesus rescues us from slavery to sin. As Moses mediated between God and people, Jesus is the only mediator between God and humanity. As Moses gave the law, Jesus gave grace and truth. Therefore, every time we read about Moses, we not only learn about an ancient hero, but also see the light of Christ, the one Moses prophesied, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me, from among you, from your brothers. It is to him you shall listen." Remember the question we posed at the beginning. What if you knew you were born to change history? Now, after going through Moses' extraordinary journey, we have a clear answer. You don't need to be perfect to be used by God. You just need to be willing to obey. Moses proved that an ordinary person with all fears, doubts, and flaws can become a powerful instrument in God's hands. He was not a Superman. He was human like us. But he chose to trust and obey when God called. Perhaps you are standing before your own Red Sea, a seemingly hopeless situation in work, family, or health. Perhaps you feel like Moses initially, "Who am I to be able to do this?" Remember that the same God who parted the Red Sea for Moses still reigns today. The same power that turned water into wine, made the blind see, and raised the dead, is still ready to intervene in your life. You don't need to be a king or a queen for God to use you. You don't need to be perfect or have special talents. You just need a heart ready to say, "Lord, I am willing," as Moses finally did. If you are going through difficult times, remember that the hardest challenges often come right before the greatest breakthroughs. Moses faced the Red Sea right before witnessing the greatest miracle. Don't give up when you are closest to victory. God has not changed. He is still looking for people like Moses. Not perfect people, but people willing to trust and obey. Your story may not be finished. In fact, the best part may just be beginning. Stretch out your hand in faith as Moses did. Step forward even when you cannot see the path clearly, and prepare to witness God do things beyond all your expectations. Because if God could use a shepherd to part the sea and lead a nation, then He can certainly use you to change the world around you. The liberation from Egypt was just the beginning of an even greater journey. As the Israelites stood on the eastern shore of the Red Sea, watching the bodies of their former oppressors wash up on the beach, they faced a new reality. They were no longer slaves, but they were not yet home. Between them and the Promised Land lay the vast Sinai wilderness, a place that would test not just their physical endurance, but the very core of their faith. Moses understood this moment better than anyone. The man who had once fled this same desert as a fugitive now stood as the appointed leader of God's chosen people. But leadership in the wilderness would prove to be far different from the dramatic confrontations with Pharaoh. Here, there would be no clear enemy to face, no obvious villain to overcome. Here, the greatest battles would be fought in the human heart, against doubt, against despair, against the constant temptation to look backward instead of forward. The first test came quickly. As they traveled into the desert, the initial euphoria of freedom began to fade, replaced by the harsh realities of desert life. The sun was merciless during the day, the cold bitter at night. Most critically, water, the most precious commodity in any desert, was scarce. When they reached Marah, after 3 days of travel, their joy at finding water turned to bitter disappointment. The water was undrinkable, too bitter for human consumption. This was Moses' first real test as a wilderness leader. In Egypt, he had spoken with the authority of God's obvious power. The plagues had been undeniable, the crossing of the Red Sea spectacular. But now, faced with a more mundane but equally desperate need, would God still respond? Would the same power that had humbled Egypt concern itself with bitter water? Moses' response revealed how much he had learned about faith during his years in this same desert as a shepherd. He did not panic, did not blame God for leading them to this place. Instead, he cried out to the Lord, and God showed him a tree. When Moses threw the tree into the water, the bitter became sweet. It was a quiet miracle without thunder or lightning, but no less profound. God was teaching His people and their leader that His provision would come in many forms, not all of them spectacular. The lesson at Marah went deeper than water purification. The Hebrew word for bitter is the same root as Miriam, a reminder that sometimes the most challenging circumstances in our lives are opportunities for God to demonstrate His power to transform. What seems bitter can become sweet when touched by divine intervention. Moses was learning to see God's hand not just in the dramatic moments, but in the daily provisions of life. But the people's complaints continued. As they journeyed deeper into the wilderness, the reality of feeding 2 million people became apparent. The provisions they had brought from Egypt were running low, and the desert offered little in the way of natural sustenance. The people began to romanticize their time in slavery, forgetting the brutality they had endured, and remembering only what seemed like security. Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full, for you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Their words cut deep into Moses' heart. How quickly they had forgotten the miraculous crossing of the Red Sea, the years of crying out for deliverance, the joy of freedom just weeks before. This complaint revealed something profound about human nature that Moses was beginning to understand as a leader. People can witness the most extraordinary miracles and still doubt when faced with ordinary challenges. They can experience dramatic deliverances and still panic at the first sign of difficulty. Moses was learning that leadership is not just about grand gestures and spectacular moments. It's about faithfully shepherding people through the mundane struggles of daily life. God's response to their complaint about food was both generous and instructive. He promised to rain bread from heaven, but with specific conditions that would teach deeper lessons about trust and dependence. The manna would appear each morning with the dew, but it could not be stored, except on the sixth day when a double portion would be provided for the Sabbath. Anyone who tried to hoard manna found it full of worms and stinking by morning. This was God's daily curriculum in faith. Each morning, the Israelites had to trust that provision would come. They could not rely on their own ability to store up security for the future. They had to learn to live in dependence on God's daily faithfulness. For Moses, this meant learning to lead a people who had to be taught to trust one day at a time. The manna itself was unlike anything they had ever seen. The word manna literally means, "What is it?" expressing their puzzlement at this strange bread from heaven. It was white like coriander seed, sweet like honey wafers, and it sustained them completely. But more than physical nourishment, it provided a daily reminder that they were utterly dependent on God's provision. No human ingenuity, no Egyptian agricultural knowledge, no stored wealth could provide what only God could give. Moses watched his people's reactions to this daily miracle with growing understanding of his role as their spiritual shepherd. Some gathered more than they needed, trying to secure themselves against future uncertainty. Others gathered exactly what was prescribed. A few tried to sleep in rather than gather fresh manna each morning. Through it all, Moses saw that leading God's people was not just about getting them from Egypt to Canaan. It was about helping them learn to live as God's people along the way. The provision of quail in the evening complemented the morning manna, giving the people meat to satisfy their physical cravings. But Moses began to see a pattern in God's provision that would shape his understanding of leadership for the rest of his life. God provided what was needed when it was needed in the way he chose to provide it. Moses' job was not to figure out how to meet every need, but to help the people trust the one who would meet every need in his own way and time. Water remained a constant challenge. At Rephidim, the people again complained bitterly about thirst, and this time their complaints turned to direct accusations against Moses. "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" They were so angry that Moses feared they might stone him. The man who had once stood confidently before Pharaoh now felt the loneliness and vulnerability that comes with leadership when people's survival instincts override their faith. Moses cried out to God, "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." God's response was both practical and symbolic. He told Moses to take some of the elders of Israel and go to a specific rock at Horeb. There, in the sight of the elders, Moses was to strike the rock with his staff, the same staff that had brought plagues on Egypt and parted the Red Sea. When Moses struck the rock, water gushed out in abundance, enough for 2 million people and their livestock. But the miracle went beyond mere water provision. The rock became a symbol of God's ability to bring life from the most unlikely sources. In the barren wilderness, from solid stone came the water of life. Paul would later write that this rock was Christ, a spiritual source of living water that followed the Israelites throughout their wilderness journey. The elders who witnessed this miracle returned to testify to the people about what they had seen. Moses was learning another crucial lesson about leadership. Sometimes you need witnesses to verify God's provision. The burdens of leadership are too great to bear alone, and God provides others to share in both the responsibility and the testimony of His faithfulness. But challenges in the wilderness came from more than just the harsh environment. Human enemies also threatened the newly freed slaves. The Amalekites, desert nomads who controlled trade routes and lived by raiding, saw the Israelites as both a threat and an opportunity. These descendants of Esau had no love for the descendants of Jacob, and they attacked the weakest and most vulnerable of the Israelites, those who lagged behind the main group. The Amalekite attack represented a new kind of test for Moses. He could not simply stretch out his staff and expect the enemy to be swallowed up by the earth or struck down by plagues. This would require actual warfare, military strategy, and human courage. Moses was being taught that faith and action must work together, that trusting God does not mean being passive in the face of opposition. Moses' response to the Amalekite threat revealed his growing maturity as a leader. He did not try to handle everything himself. Instead, he divided responsibilities. He instructed Joshua to choose men and fight against Amalek, while Moses himself went to the top of a hill with the staff of God in his hand. This division of labor showed Moses' recognition that leadership involves empowering others and working as a team. The battle itself became one of the most vivid illustrations of intercession in all of Scripture. As long as Moses held up his hands with the staff, Israel prevailed. But when his hands grew tired and lowered, Amalek began to win. Moses' physical position directly affected the spiritual battle being fought below. This was not magic or superstition. It was a profound demonstration of how earthly battles are won or lost in the heavenly realm through prayer and intercession. Aaron and Hur, recognizing what was happening, brought a stone for Moses to sit on and supported his hands, one on each side, until sunset. The image is striking: the leader exhausted by the weight of intercession, being supported by faithful companions who shared in the spiritual battle. Moses was learning that even intercessory leadership requires community and support. The victory over Amalek was complete, but God's instructions to Moses afterward revealed the seriousness of what had occurred. God commanded Moses to write this victory as a memorial in a book and recite it to Joshua, "I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven." The Amalekites had not just attacked Israel's bodies, they had attacked the weak and vulnerable, opposing God's redemptive purposes. This made them enemies not just of Israel, but of God Himself. Moses built an altar and called it, "The Lord is my banner," recognizing that the victory had come not through military superiority, but through divine intervention. The staff in his raised hands had been like a banner or flag, signaling God's presence and power in the battle. Moses was learning to see every victory as a testimony to God's faithfulness rather than human achievement. The visit of Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought another crucial lesson in leadership. Jethro observed Moses from morning until evening, settling disputes and making decisions for all the people. With his outsider's perspective, Jethro could see what Moses, in the midst of his responsibilities, could not. This system was unsustainable and ultimately harmful to both Moses and the people. "What you are doing is not good," Jethro told Moses with the frankness that only a wise elder can provide. "You and the people with you will certainly wear yourselves out, for the thing is too heavy for you. You are not able to do it alone." Jethro's observation went to the heart of a common leadership mistake, trying to be indispensable rather than developing others. Jethro's solution was both practical and profound: establish a system of judges to handle routine matters, reserving only the most difficult cases for Moses himself. Choose able men who fear God, men of truth who hate bribes. Create levels of authority, leaders of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. This would not only relieve Moses of overwhelming responsibility, but would also prepare the people for the kind of society they would need in the Promised Land. Moses' acceptance of Jethro's advice demonstrated remarkable humility for a man who spoke directly with God. He could have dismissed the suggestion, claiming that God had not revealed this system to him. Instead, he recognized wisdom wherever it came from and implemented the changes immediately. This showed Moses' growing understanding that God can provide guidance through many channels, not just through direct revelation. The delegation of authority also represented a crucial shift in Moses' understanding of his role. He was not called to be the solution to every problem, but to be the one who established systems and trained others to solve problems. He was learning to work himself out of certain jobs so that he could focus on the unique calling that only he could fulfill. The effectiveness of this new system became immediately apparent. The people's needs were met more efficiently. Moses was freed from exhaustion, and a whole generation of leaders was trained in justice and judgment. But more importantly, Moses learned a lesson that would serve him well in the greater challenges ahead. Effective leadership multiplies itself through others. As the Israelites approached Mount Sinai, Moses felt the weight of anticipation. This was the mountain where God had first called him from the burning bush, where his life had been forever changed. Now he was returning not as a fugitive shepherd, but as the leader of God's people. The journey from that first encounter to this moment had transformed him from a reluctant spokesperson into a seasoned leader who had learned to trust God through every kind of challenge. The people camped at the base of the mountain, and Moses went up to meet with God. The message he received was both a reminder of the past and a preview of the future. "You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. This was the purpose behind all the miracles, all the provision, all the guidance through the wilderness. God had not rescued Israel simply to give them freedom from slavery. He had rescued them to make them His own special people, a nation that would represent Him to the world. They were to be a kingdom of priests, mediators between God and the nations around them. They were to be a holy nation, set apart for God's purposes and reflecting His character to the world. When Moses brought this message to the people, their response was immediate and unanimous. All that the Lord has spoken, we will do. But Moses, with his growing experience of human nature, probably had some reservations about their confidence. He had seen how quickly they could forget miracles and turn to complaining. He had witnessed their tendency to panic at the first sign of difficulty. Their enthusiasm was genuine, but Moses understood that good intentions would need to be backed up by concrete commitment and systematic training. God's instructions for the giving of the law were carefully designed to impress upon the people the seriousness of what was about to happen. The people were to consecrate themselves for 3 days, washing their clothes and preparing their hearts. They were to set boundaries around the mountain so that no one would accidentally approach the sacred space and die. On the 3rd day, God would come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. The morning of the 3rd day brought a display of divine power, unlike anything the Israelites had ever experienced. Thunder rolled across the desert, lightning split the sky, and a thick cloud enveloped the mountain. The sound of a trumpet grew louder and louder, causing the entire camp to tremble with fear. The mountain itself smoked like a furnace, because the Lord descended on it in fire, and the whole mountain quaked violently. Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, but they stood at a distance, overwhelmed by the terrifying display of divine holiness. This was not the God of comfortable religion or casual spirituality. This was the God of absolute holiness, consuming fire and awesome power. The people's easy confidence of 3 days earlier was replaced by trembling fear. God called Moses up to the top of the mountain, and there, in the midst of the cloud and fire, He spoke the words that would become the foundation of human morality and social justice, the 10 Commandments. These were not suggestions or philosophical principles. They were direct commands from the Creator of the universe, given with all the authority of His absolute sovereignty. The first 4 commandments dealt with humanity's relationship to God. No other gods, no graven images, no taking God's name in vain and keeping the Sabbath holy. These established the vertical dimension of human existence, the recognition that life finds its meaning and purpose only in proper relationship with the Creator. The last 6 commandments addressed horizontal relationships, how humans should treat one another. Honor your parents, do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness, do not covet. These were not arbitrary rules, but reflections of God's own character principles that would create the kind of society where human beings could flourish. As Moses received these commandments, he understood that he was witnessing a moment of unprecedented significance in human history. Never before had a nation received its laws directly from God. Never before had moral principles been given with such clarity and authority. Never before had a people been called to live according to divine standards rather than human preferences. But the 10 Commandments were just the beginning. Over the following days, God gave Moses detailed instructions for civil law, ceremonial law, and moral guidance that would govern every aspect of Israel's life. Laws for justice, laws for worship laws, for social relationships, laws for economic fairness, a complete blueprint for a society based on God's character. Moses spent 40 days and nights on the mountain, receiving not only the laws, but also detailed instructions for the construction of the tabernacle, a portable sanctuary where God would dwell among His people. The tabernacle would be the visible symbol of God's presence with Israel, the place where heaven and earth would meet through the system of sacrifices and priestly mediation. During those 40 days, Moses experienced communion with God, unlike anything any human had known before or since. He was in the direct presence of the Almighty, receiving revelation that would shape not only Israel, but all of human civilization. The laws he received would influence legal systems for millennia. The moral principles would become the foundation of Western civilization. The concept of human dignity, rooted in divine creation, would eventually lead to ideas of universal human rights. But while Moses was experiencing the heights of divine revelation, the people at the base of the mountain were struggling with a very different kind of experience. The prolonged absence of their leader, combined with the terrifying manifestations of God's presence on the mountain, created anxiety and uncertainty. They began to wonder if Moses would ever return, if he had been consumed by the fire that enveloped the mountain peak. Their solution to this uncertainty revealed how little they had truly learned from all the miracles they had witnessed. They came to Aaron and demanded, "Make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." In their fear and impatience, they were ready to abandon the God who had just delivered them from slavery and create gods they could see and control. Aaron's response to their demand was a tragic failure of leadership. Instead of reminding the people of all God had done for them, instead of calling them to wait faithfully for Moses' return, he capitulated to their demands. He collected their gold jewelry and fashioned it into the image of a calf, borrowing from the Egyptian religious imagery they had grown up with. The golden calf represented everything God had forbidden in the second commandment. It was an attempt to reduce the infinite God to a finite image to make the invisible God visible and manageable. It was a rejection of the faith that trusts without seeing, replacing it with the false security of something tangible and controllable. When the calf was complete, Aaron built an altar before it and proclaimed, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord." The tragedy was compounded by Aaron's attempt to syncretize this idolatry with worship of the true God. He was not trying to replace Yahweh, but to worship Him through the image of the calf. But God had made it clear that He would not be worshipped through any created image. The people's response was immediate and enthusiastic. They rose early the next morning, offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the golden calf, and then sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. The word play here carries connotations of sexual immorality and wild revelry. Within hours of making the idol, the people had descended into the kind of pagan celebration they had known in Egypt. Meanwhile, on the mountain, God informed Moses of what was happening below. "Go down, for your people, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way that I commanded them." Note that God called them your people rather than my people, indicating his anger at their betrayal. God's anger burned hot against the people's sin, and he proposed to Moses a shocking solution. "Now therefore, let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, in order that I may make a great nation of you." God offered to start over with Moses, to make him the father of a new chosen people, and abandon the rebels at the mountain's base. This was perhaps the greatest test Moses had ever faced. God was offering him everything his ego might desire: to be the new Abraham, the founder of God's people, to have his name remembered forever as the one through whom God's promises were fulfilled. All Moses had to do was step aside and let God's wrath consume the people who had complained against him, doubted him, and now betrayed the very God who had saved them. Moses' response revealed the depth of his transformation from self-centered prince to servant-hearted leader. Instead of accepting God's offer, he interceded for the very people who had caused him nothing but trouble. His prayer was a masterpiece of intercession, appealing to God's reputation among the nations, his promises to the patriarchs, and his own character. Why should the Egyptians say, "With evil intent did he bring them out to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth"? Turn from your burning anger and relent from this disaster against your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self, and said to them, "I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have promised I will give to your offspring, and they shall inherit it forever." Moses was willing to sacrifice his own potential greatness for the sake of people who had betrayed both him and God. This was leadership at its highest level, not seeking personal advantage, but the welfare of those under his care, even when they didn't deserve it. Moses had learned to love as God loves, with a love that persists despite betrayal and ingratitude. God's response to Moses' intercession was immediate, and the Lord relented from the disaster that he had spoken of bringing on his people. This was not because God changed his mind about the seriousness of their sin, but because Moses had fulfilled his role as intercessor, standing in the gap between God's justice and the people's sin. But Moses' intercession from the mountain was only the beginning. When he came down and saw the golden calf and the people's revelry, with his own eyes, his own anger burned hot. The sight of their betrayal, after all God had done for them, after the clear commands they had just heard from Mount Sinai, was more than he could bear. In his righteous anger, he threw down the tablets of the law, breaking them at the foot of the mountain. The broken tablets were a powerful symbol. The people had already broken God's law in their hearts. Now Moses' action made that spiritual reality visible in physical form. The covenant had been shattered by their rebellion, and the broken stone bore witness to their faithfulness. Moses' response to the crisis was swift and decisive. He took the golden calf, burned it with fire, ground it to powder, scattered it on the water, and made the people drink it. This was not mere destruction, but a symbolic act showing the worthlessness of their idol. The God they thought would save them became literally waste in their bodies. Moses then confronted Aaron. "What did this people do to you that you have brought such a great sin upon them?" Aaron's response revealed the weakness of his leadership. "You know the people that they are set on evil. They said to me, 'Make us gods who shall go before us.' So I said to them, 'Let any who have gold take it off.' So they gave it to me, and I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf." Aaron's excuse was pathetic in its dishonesty. He portrayed himself as a passive victim of the people's demands and claimed the calf had somehow formed itself in the fire. This was leadership failure at its worst. Refusing to take responsibility for moral compromise and trying to blame others for the consequences of weak decisions. Moses saw that the people were out of control and that their rebellion had made them a laughingstock to their enemies. Decisive action was needed to restore order and demonstrate the seriousness of their sin. He stood in the gate of the camp and called out, "Who is on the Lord's side? Come to me."